Thank you. I'm honored to speak to you today about restoring the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is essential for all life and needed to grow food and people. Our bodies use phosphorus to convert food to energy, to build bones, and to store genetic information needed for our cells to divide and grow and to have children. We all need phosphorus in our bodies. And so in that sense, it is a good thing. But by disrupting the phosphorus cycle, by managing it badly, we have created algae blooms in lakes, as you see on the right up here. This is the surface of Lake Mendota during an algae bloom. And I'll tell you more about Lake Mendota in a minute. And this is the surface of Lake Mendota when the water is clear. And this bloom is caused by too much phosphorus in the wrong place. First, I will tell you how we damage the phosphorus cycle and our water using my region, Madison, Wisconsin, as an example. Madison is marked up there in the United States, this star right here. We are over here in Japan. What's in the middle looks like a large lake, but is, of course, the Pacific Ocean. So this gives you some perspective as to where I am from. After describing the situation in the Yahara watershed, my home, I will briefly summarize the situation for the United States as a whole, where I know the data well and we have very good data, and then I will summarize the global situation and tell you how to restore the phosphorus cycle. Our lakes were formed after the glaciers melted about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So what you see here is a very large lake filled with meltwater from the glaciers. And later, as the water ran away downhill and as conditions dried, the lakes emerged, and you see the four main lakes outlined in red on the diagram. The red shows the shorelines of the current lakes. The headwater lake, Mendota, at the top of the slide is the lake that I will tell you a bit about. My office sits on the shore of Lake Mendota, and I saw the lake nearly every day for more than 40 years. So I think of it as an old friend. The first peoples came from Asia and colonized the area around Lake Mendota and the lower lakes. They harvested the abundant game around the lake. They fished. They caught waterfowl and ate clams from the lake and used the many native plants that grew around the lakes. Now the lakes are surrounded by Madison, the capital city, with one of the world's great research universities and productive biotech and high-tech industries. The headwater Lake Mendota, this one, so this is Lake Mendota, is surrounded by city in pink. And the farmland is in yellow. Natural land is in green, and there's not much natural land anymore. The enrichment of Lake Mendota turned it green. Here's a satellite image of the lake, and the green is algae blooms, blooms of toxic cyanobacteria. And that change in the lakes was not gradual. It occurred in four big lurches, and I'm going to organize a few slides about those lurches. So this is a timeline showing the history of the lake from 1800 to 2000. So in terms of the lifetime of the lake geologically, 200 years is a tiny amount, but to a human, it's at least several lifetimes. In the 1870s, when the Euro-Americans first came and the Native Americans were persecuted and driven away, we plowed the prairie, and immediately increased erosion. And we know this from analyzing the sediments of the lake. And there is now a black soil deposit in the bottom of the lake that's about 75 centimeters thick from that single erosion event in the 1870s caused by breaking that rich prairie sod with moldboard plows. So that was one perturbation that eutrophied the lake. By the 1880s, the lake had algae blooms in it, and we know this from the first limnologists. In 1875, the science of limnology began on the shores of Lake Mendota, so we actually had a limnologist there to tell us about the algae blooms. Oxygen disappeared from deep water, and we began to have fish kills. The reason was that soil that had run off had high sulfate in it. The sulfate in the gypsum soil combined with iron and formed insoluble pyrite, stripped the iron from the water, and we had very high phosphate levels and blooms. After World War II, agriculture became industrial. Many countries had invested in factories to make gunpowder, and the process for making gunpowder can also be used to make nitrogen fertilizer. To use the nitrogen, plants needed phosphorus, and the logical thing to do was go obtain the phosphorus from the earth, combine it with the industrially fixed nitrogen, and try to fertilize plants with it. The greater plant production enabled us to grow more food and feed some of that food to livestock, to chickens, pigs, cattle, and whatnot. And in our area, that enabled the expansion of dairy and extensive production of cow manure. So this fertilization created more crop production and animal production, but it also caused more runoff to the lakes. The manure would run off in rainstorms and run down the streams and pollute the lakes. And now we're experiencing a wetter climate with lots of storms. The return time of a 100-millimeter storm, the graph on the left, the return time is the average time between a storm of a given size. And in this case, you're looking at the return time of a storm of at least 100 millimeters in one day. And that's plotted against time. This is from a statistical model fitted to data. And in 1940, it took more than 5 years, more than 5.5 years was the average gap between storms as large as 100 millimeters. And now in 2020, the gap is down almost as small as every other year. So every other year we get a storm about that big. The slides on the right show you what happened during a 100-millimeter storm in 2008. This is the University of Wisconsin campus, so several people had very wet commutes home from work that day. I'm sure they were unhappy about it. And the runoff from farm fields that's carrying phosphorus into the lakes increased. In 2018, a storm caused flooding in downtown Madison. This is the isthmus between Lake Mendota and Lake Monona, and the blue shows flooding into the city, affecting the businesses along the main roads and drowning hundreds of houses from a single rainstorm. Kansai Airport got a big storm about the same time, and I had visited Kansai Airport a couple of years before, so I was saddened to see how wet Kansai Airport became as well. So I know Japan is familiar with these big storms. So now we have seen 4 big transitions in the Lake Mendota watershed. The first was the erosion of the topsoil into the lake, turning up the speed of phosphorus cycling, and that occurred in the 1870s. The second was industrial agriculture with fertilizers, and that occurred after 1850. The fertilizers brought additional phosphorus into the lake and also allowed the expansion of the dairy industry and more manure with more phosphorus into the lake. And that is the third transition. And the fourth transition happened more recently, and that is more extreme precipitation and erosion of fertilizers and manure. The consequence is more blooms, more toxicity, and it's more costly to clean water. This is a drone photo of the surface of Lake Mendota, and this is a boat moving through one of the blooms. So it's very unpleasant green glop, and it's toxic. The species are poisonous, and inhaling the spray from the boat, for example, is dangerous. Within a year, the water clarity fluctuates a lot. Here I picked 2017 as just as an example, and the vertical axis here is the density of cyanobacteria of poisonous blue-green algae, and the day of the year is shown on the horizontal axis, and you can see that there are very extreme fluctuations from low to high levels. And here is a duck this duck was photographed in 2017, and you can see that the ducks leave trails through the water. So if you lose your duck, you might be able to find it by following the trail. In 2010, I led a project with several top faculty from the University of Wisconsin-Madison to try to focus public attention on the problems of the lakes and try to lead to more action to improve them. The approach we took was to develop scenarios for how the lake might turn out in the future. We used public workshops to develop these scenarios by having conversations with people about what they hoped for in the future, what they feared about the future, what they thought our strengths were to face the future, and what they thought our weaknesses were, how were we vulnerable. We then converted those into short stories written by a real author, not by me, but by Jenny Seifert, who is an actual writer, and illustrated by a real artist, John Miller. So these were illustrated stories. We produced a reader's guide. We also did video versions of each story, and there was a public television special about the stories about the future out to 2070. And this led to a lot of public discussion. I was invited to give public talks almost every month for a period of a couple of years. And even now, I still get invitations to talk about it. And I know that citizens groups are talking about the stories. Public values and politicians began to change, and so far to date, we've seen some positive results. The county has started to buy farms that go up for sale when the farmers retire and convert them to native vegetation. One of our calculations was that if we can get the watershed up to 50% native vegetation, then a lot of the problems of the lake will will go away. The native vegetation reduces floods, improves water quality, and of course stores carbon as a benefit. An organization called Yahara Pride Farmers has emerged, and it's farmers working on their farms to develop ways of managing manure better. And they've been very successful in figuring out new ways of reducing manure runoff. The county's invested in manure digesters, and there is now a project to recycle phosphorus-rich sediment by dredging it from the feeder streams into the lake. And I think we're having a better public conversation about the future. It's the project has generated tremendous interest. There has been a short story contest where the winning stories were read on the public radio station. School children are developing their own stories about the future and discussing them, and a consequence of the project has been to activate that discussion. Now I'm going to change scale and talk about the United States phosphorus situation, and then talk briefly about the world phosphorus situation. Phosphorus is overused throughout the United States. In this map, the dark green color is over-enriched soil, soil that has too much phosphorus in it, and we have a lot of it. We put together a budget for the United States phosphorus a few years ago. So the budget shows total domestic phosphorus use, mineral phosphorus, phosphorus that's mined from the earth, how it comes in. We also look at imported phosphorus and other phosphorus inputs. And the outputs are exports to other countries, accumulation in agricultural soils, on-farm losses, which is basically phosphorus. We're not sure where that went. A lot of it is wind erosion. Phosphorus contained in biofuel grains, net processing losses, and phosphorus consumption in U.S. diets. There are three things that jump out at me. One is exports exceed imports. So the United States is a net exporter of phosphorus, and not so much in mined mineral phosphorus, but in animals and plants that are eaten elsewhere. Only 8% of our phosphorus is consumed by people. So before we did this, I had thought that the whole point of agriculture is to take phosphorus from soil and put it in people. And it turns out that it's incredibly inefficient at doing that. We could just give the people phosphorus rock to sprinkle on their cereal, and it would probably do a better job. More than half is added to the environment. So all of these other outputs, which add up to more than half of the phosphorus that's applied to the soil, end up in the environment. So they're treated as waste, and most of it goes to water, and most of it creates green, toxic algal blooms, as I showed you earlier. And I believe that the situation for the United States is similar to the situation in other industrialized countries with industrial agriculture, and there are quite a few of those. So what's the situation globally? This plot shows time on the x-axis measured as human population. And since human population of the Earth has only gone up, you can use population as an index of time. And this axis shows several different things in standardized units, but the green symbols, these green symbols are grain production. So this plot shows demand-driven grain production. As there are more people, they need more food, and the agricultural system feeds them, and we feed people by growing grain. We might convert some of the grain into cows, pigs, or chickens, but essentially we grow grain, and the human demand for grain is met by agriculture, and we grow more grain. How do we do that? Well, for a while, from when our population was only 1, 2, or 3 billion, we did it by putting more land into production. So we cleared forest, cleared grassland, and had more land working for humanity. At about 3 billion people, we ran out of land, ran out of arable land, and so the amount of land brought into production was not growing very fast. We dealt with that problem, again, as a planet, as a species on the planet, by irrigating more. So the blue symbols are irrigation, and we irrigate a lot. We irrigate to the point where some of the world's major aquifers, the aquifers in India, for example, and the Ogallala aquifer in the center of the United States are running dry. So eventually we're going to see this blue curve flatten out. And then also around 3 billion people, we started using commercial fertilizers. We started adding industrial fertilizer, and that continued to increase. We've obtained that fertilizer mostly by industrial processes since we were at 3 billion. This slide shows the human input to the planetary cycle divided by natural input to the planetary cycle. And for carbon, we have had a very large effect on the flux. Humans now, the human flux of carbon is now about 35 times the natural flux, and that is the underlying cause of climate change, as we've discussed earlier. So everyone knows that. Phosphorus is the next biggest increase at about 14 times. And nitrogen has also increased a lot. Nitrogen is increased. The increase in nitrogen has come from industrial fixation of atmospheric nitrogen by burning coal, mostly. So phosphorus is overapplied in many regions, and the regions that are highlighted here are regions of intensive agricultural production. Phosphorus demand is projected to rise. This is a study that was done for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and then published in 2010 by Detlef van Vuren and his group at RIVM in the Netherlands. And so far we're on track to match those projections. And by 2100 it will rise even further. Most of the phosphorus that's mined comes from Morocco and Western Sahara. This study by Elser and Bennett in Nature a few years ago. In 2007-2008, there was a global shortage of phosphorus caused by political dissension, political strife within Morocco or between Morocco and Western Sahara. And their phosphorus came off the market for about a year. China got nervous and took their phosphorus off the market, and South Africa also began to get concerned and withdrew its phosphorus. And the result was a skyrocket in the price of phosphorus. Poor farmers could not afford to buy nutrients, to buy fertilizer, and that led to food shortages around the world, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and that was about the time of the Arab Spring revolts in those countries, and several articles have been written about the connection between phosphorus, food, and the Arab Spring. So phosphorus is essential for food production, but it's also a serious water pollutant that harms our health, and it's a cause of global instability. So how much phosphorus should we add, or can we add, to the biosphere and still have healthy water? We calculated this as part of the Planetary Boundaries Project. We came up with a maximum amount of phosphorus for healthy water based on World Health Organization guidelines, and I won't go through the details of that calculation, but we had a globally accepted number for the maximum added to the water. So how much can we add by mining to soils and still meet that goal? That was the purpose of the calculation. Due to lack of time, I'm not going to lead you through the technical details, but we came up with a low estimate and a high estimate, so low in green, high in yellow, of the planetary boundary for three measures of the boundary: phosphorus input to fresh water, phosphorus added to soil as fertilizer, and the amount of phosphorus in soil. The range between low and high is simply due to uncertainty in the global numbers. So that led to this range. No matter which number you pick, green or yellow, the current level of phosphorus in all three measures is far above even the highest estimate. So we have blown past the planetary boundary for phosphorus. We're way above it. So that leads to how do we change to a better future, which is that's the fifth transition that we all hope for. And to answer that question, we can go back to the planetary boundary diagram that we use to calculate the boundary for phosphorus. And very simply, we need to do less mining. We need to recycle more phosphorus to soils. So human waste, livestock waste, crop waste needs to be recycled to soils, not simply discarded. And if we do that, our models show that there will be less runoff to rivers and lakes, and we'll have cleaner water for human use. So, a quick summary: I have made the following main points. Phosphorus is a rare element that is essential for life. We have extracted phosphorus at 14 times the natural rate. Excess phosphorus causes toxic blooms that impair fresh waters and impair human health. Phosphorus needs can be met by recycling waste to soil at a supply rate that meets the demand for plant growth. So simply create a closed system so the amount of phosphorus that's added is needed by the plants and no more. Recycling phosphorus improves water quality and human health and stabilizes the food supply. And I'll close there. I hope there are a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you very much.